Did you know that the history of the Roman Empire hides a secret that few people know? While we often hear about emperors, senators, and Roman generals, there was a group of people who had a profound and silent impact on building this great civilization: Africans. But how did they influence Rome's economy, culture, and even its army? And why does almost no one talk about it? Get ready to uncover a hidden part of history that might completely change the way you see the Roman Empire. What you're about to hear may surprise you, and even challenge what you thought you knew about Rome. Stay with me until the end, because this story has some unexpected twists. In the vast and imposing Roman Empire, where the stones of the Eternal City reflected the grandeur of a civilization that ruled the known world, there was something many still didn't see: the influence of the distant lands of Africa. Although most associated Rome with an empire of European origins, its borders stretched beyond Italy, reaching Egypt, Carthage, Mauritania, and what we now know as Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. These territories were not only sources of wealth for Rome, but also places from which people, ideas, skills, and cultures came, shaping the empire itself. Let's imagine the scene. The sun shone brightly over the Roman Forum, where thousands of Romans gathered, while in the center of the square, a group of Africans passed by. Merchants from Mauritania with their colorful tunics and sun-bronzed skin from the desert heat, offering exotic fabrics and rare spices. The scent of myrrh and incense filled the air. As they moved through the city, people stepped aside to admire the goods and, above all, the unfamiliar faces and sounds of a different language, now becoming part of the vibrant urban tapestry of Rome. In the distance, on the Campus Martius, a detachment of African soldiers from Egypt was training. These men, who had been recruited from distant lands, were not just imposing warriors. They were an elite force. Many of them had crossed the Mediterranean Sea, overcoming fierce winds and turbulent waves, to reach Rome, where they would serve with honor and loyalty. For the empire, the presence of these soldiers was not just a sign of military strength, but also a symbol of how Rome was becoming a meeting point for various peoples, cultures, and traditions. In the corridors of power, the African presence was equally significant. Governors of provinces, administrators, and even African philosophers were among the emperor's chief advisors. Egypt, with its rich cultural heritage, stood out as a center of learning, where spiritual and scientific traditions were preserved and passed down. Many Africans, once unknown, began to hold prestigious positions, demonstrating that Rome, in its quest for power and stability, not only absorbed wealth, but also the contributions of those it conquered. However, it wasn't only Africans who came from distant lands. Rome was a melting pot of cultures, where the influences of every corner of the empire were mixed. The streets of Rome, with their bustling markets and grand squares, were like a reflection of this diversity. There were Romans who spoke Greek, Egyptians teaching philosophy, and soldiers from far-off lands, whose stories and struggles were intertwined with the empire's battles. This empire, far from being a world exclusive to Europeans, was actually a multicultural empire, where everyone from different parts of the known world left their mark. The African legacy, therefore, cannot be underestimated. Those who came from Africa to Rome contributed not only with their practical skills, like soldiers and merchants, but also with something deeper: a worldview rich in stories, beliefs, philosophies, and innovations. They challenged the idea of a homogeneous Rome and instead helped form an empire where different cultures not only coexisted, but also intertwined, creating a Rome stronger, more complex, and more fascinating than one could imagine. This story of cultural exchange was not confined only to the streets of Rome, but spread throughout the empire, where African influences intertwined with local traditions and the aspirations of an empire that, above all, wished to remain undefeated and immortal. And so, the Africans in Rome were not merely observers or supporting actors. They were key players in the construction of one of the most powerful and enduring civilizations in human history. And how would this encounter between Rome and Africa shape the future of the empire? What was to come when such distinct cultures met and fused? Rome, the capital of an empire stretching from the Atlantic to the shores of Asia Minor, was not just a city of vast palaces, temples, and bustling markets. It was, above all, a pulsating center of cultural exchange, where peoples of different origins, languages, and traditions met and fused. In the streets of Rome, diversity was visible at every corner, and this mixture not only enriched everyday life, but was the very foundation of the empire. When we looked at the city of Rome, the streets and squares were filled with foreigners. Some came from distant lands like Africa, Asia Minor, and the British Isles, bringing with them not only goods but also stories, beliefs, and knowledge. The Roman Forum, with its imposing architecture, was the place where the world met, and there, in the intertwining of cultures, Rome became not only a military power, but also a vibrant center of innovation and exchange. In the city, one could hear the sounds of different languages. Latin, of course, but also Greek, Egyptian, Aramaic, Celtic, African, and many others. Greek, for example, was not only the language of rulers and philosophers, but the language of artists, doctors, and even soldiers. And with this diversity of peoples came an immense wealth of traditions. Rome, known for its ability to absorb and adapt, not only conquered lands but absorbed the cultures it encountered, adapting them to its way of life. Religion, art, and science were fields where cultural exchange was most evident. The Romans, being pragmatic by nature, often adapted the beliefs and practices of other peoples into their own system. The cult of Isis, for instance, an Egyptian goddess, found a large following in Rome, and her temples were meeting points for those seeking not only a spiritual experience, but also a glimpse of Egypt's mystical and rich culture. The Romans, who already worshipped their own gods, did not hesitate to incorporate these foreign cults, like the cult of Mithras, which of Persian origin spread among Roman soldiers, creating a unique religious fusion. In the field of art, Rome absorbed influences from all parts of the empire. Egyptian and Greek sculptures adorned Roman palaces, while Greek and Phoenician building techniques influenced Roman engineers in their grand constructions. Architects and artists from various parts of the empire, from Egypt, Asia Minor, and Carthage, brought their own techniques and styles to Rome, mixing them with Roman methods, creating a unique style that would later influence the Western world for centuries. And of course, we cannot forget about the cuisine. The market in Rome, filled with spices and exotic ingredients from Africa, Asia, and Europe, made the city a true feast of flavors and aromas. Egyptian wheat, fruits from North Africa, and Oriental spices were key ingredients in the Roman diet, and recipes spread throughout the city, creating dishes that blended influences from various regions. However, this cultural exchange did not occur only one-sidedly. While Rome absorbed and adapted many of these influences, it also imposed its own traditions and practices on the conquered provinces. Ultimately, the Roman Empire functioned as an interconnected network, where, despite regional differences, the ideas and innovations of each culture were shared and transformed, creating something greater than the sum of its parts. In cities like Alexandria, Carthage, and Antioch, people could feel this vibrant exchange of cultures. Trade flourished, but at the same time, ideas circulated. The African merchants who arrived in Rome were not just bringing precious goods, but also wisdom, religions, and philosophies that would shape the minds of Romans and all those who lived within the empire. The Roman Empire, with its ability to integrate, adapt, and innovate, was not just an empire of swords and conquests, but also an empire of minds and hearts intertwined. And in this vast mosaic of cultures, every piece of conquered land brought something new, something that would fuse with Rome and, in many cases, help define the future of the empire. Thus, Rome not only ruled the known world, it transformed it, creating a civilization that fed off the riches of the cultures surrounding it, and in turn, left its mark on everything it touched. How would these influences continue to shape Rome? And how would the city react to the constant cultural exchange that made it so unique? The Mediterranean, the vast sea that separated but also united the lands of Rome and Africa, was much more than just a body of water. For the Romans, it represented a path of communication and trade, a vital route that connected the various provinces of the empire. It was a lifeline linking cultures, economies, and peoples that might otherwise have remained distant and isolated. In Rome, the Mediterranean was the center of an intricate system of navigation and trade, and the sea routes not only transported goods between the empire's coastal cities, but also allowed the exchange of ideas and cultures. Roman vessels, designed to face the sea and navigate currents, carried not only fabrics and precious commodities, but also the very essence of the cultures that brought them. The waters of the Mediterranean directly connected Rome to Egypt, one of its most vital provinces. Egypt, with its fertile land and unique climate, was Rome's granary, providing much of the grain that fed the city and its population. Without the steady supply of Egyptian wheat, Rome would have faced serious difficulties in sustaining its growing population. Egyptian wheat, grown along the banks of the Nile, would be shipped to the port of Alexandria, from where it would travel onto Rome, feeding the mouths of the empire. But it wasn't just grain that crossed the Mediterranean. Precious goods from Africa, such as gold and ivory, were carried by ships crossing the sea to Roman ports. African gold, sourced from regions like Nubia and the Sahara, was one of the most coveted commodities by the Romans. It was used to mint coins, create jewelry and adornments, and even in large construction projects. Ivory, from elephants in North Africa, became raw material for sculptures and luxurious furniture, highly valued by the Roman elite. The exchange of material goods was just one part of this complex web of relations between Rome and Africa. The Mediterranean also served as a conduit for the transport of people. African traders, such as those from Carthage, and slaves, who were brought to work on Roman estates or in arenas, crossed these waters in vessels. These encounters weren't merely commercial transactions, but moments of cultural exchange, where traditions, customs, and ideas mingled, expanding the reach and sophistication of Roman civilization. Additionally, the Mediterranean was not only a trade route. It was also a source of political and military connections. The sea routes allowed Roman legions to quickly move between provinces, facilitating control of a vast and diverse empire. Egypt, with its dominance over the Nile, was a strategic point, and Rome understood the importance of maintaining good relations with this rich province. When the need arose to reinforce control over Egypt, the Romans swiftly sent their forces across the Mediterranean, ensuring that the grain trade and access to Egyptian culture continued to thrive. However, this vast sea was not free from challenges. Pirates, coming from various parts of the Mediterranean world, frequently attacked Roman ships, threatening the flow of goods and people. Rome, in turn, did not hesitate to respond. Its naval forces, one of the largest in the ancient world, constantly patrolled the Mediterranean waters to ensure that trade and the empire's security were maintained. Over time, the Mediterranean ceased to be merely a dividing line between distant lands. It became, for the Romans, a symbol of unity, connecting and consolidating the vast network of lands that formed the empire. From Rome to Egypt, Greece to Hispania, and from the coasts of Africa to the Middle East, the sea was the bridge that united civilizations under the aegis of Roman power. And so, through the Mediterranean, Rome not only sustained its economic and political greatness, but also created lasting bonds with the cultures and peoples of distant lands. The Mediterranean, with its deep and vast waters, ensured that Rome was not an isolated city but a global empire, whose web of relations was built, day by day, along its trade and cultural routes. This immense sea, which seemed to separate, in reality united peoples and their riches, becoming the backbone of the Roman Empire. How would the Mediterranean continue to be vital for Rome, and what other surprises might it still hold in its depths? The trade between Rome and the African lands was one of the pillars that supported the grandeur of the empire, and the impact that Africa had on the Roman economy was immense. As trade routes expanded across the Mediterranean, African commerce intensified, bringing not only precious goods, but also new ideas and influences that shaped life in Rome. African traders were key figures in Roman daily life, with their commercial practices directly affecting society, government, and even popular culture. The trade of African products was immense and diverse. Perhaps the most famous of these products was ivory, a material highly sought after in Rome for creating sculptures and luxury objects. African ivory reached Roman ports, where Roman artisans would carve it into intricate and impressive forms, creating everything from small figurines to furniture and decorative items for the homes of the wealthy. The luxury of these items was a symbol of status and wealth, and their demand from the Roman elite made the ivory trade thrive. But ivory wasn't the only African treasure that captivated the Romans. North Africa, with its vast savannas and deserts, also provided wild animals that became a spectacle in the world of Roman arenas. Lions, elephants, leopards, and other exotic animals were brought from distant lands to be showcased in battles and hunts, entertaining the Roman crowds. These animals, with their strength and abilities, were symbols of imperial power and the grandeur of the empire. The arenas became settings for bloody battles between gladiators and beasts, and the presence of these African animals in the arenas only added to the mystique and fascination surrounding Africa. The spice trade also played a crucial role. The Romans loved exotic spices and aromatic herbs from the south, including incense and myrrh, which were used in religious rituals, festivals, and even banquets. The spices not only enhanced the flavor of Roman food, but also had symbolic value. They were associated with wealth, the mystery of the East, and of course the greatness of Rome, which had access to these rare products thanks to its empire. African slaves were also a fundamental part of this trade, though undoubtedly the darkest aspect of the commercial exchanges between Rome and Africa. Many Africans were captured and sold as slaves, taken to Rome to work in a variety of roles, from farmers and domestic servants to gladiators and soldiers. Slavery was a common practice in the Roman Empire, and Africans were considered one of the most important sources of this forced labor. However, Africans were not solely subjected to slavery. Some managed, through skill or luck, to gain their freedom and become prosperous merchants, doctors, artisans, or even members of the Roman elite. African traders, with their ability to navigate the empire's complex commercial and cultural networks, established direct contact with Roman aristocratic families. Many of these traders were of Carthaginian, Berber, or Egyptian origin, and had a refined understanding of Roman markets. Some became wealthy, influential, and even gained admission to the highest echelons of Roman society. The homes of the Roman elite were filled with African products, from exquisite furniture to exotic animal skins, serving as proof of their owner's status and position. In addition to material goods, African trade brought with it a deeper exchange, cultural exchange. The presence of Africans in Rome was not limited to the trade of goods. They also brought knowledge, stories, and traditions. African merchants, interacting with Romans, shared myths and legends passed down through generations, and these stories were often incorporated into Roman life, further enriching the cultural mosaic of the empire. This exchange of goods and cultures helped strengthen the connection between Rome and Africa, making trade not only an economic bridge, but also a social and cultural one. The wealth flowing from Africa to Rome was not just about gold and ivory, but a true exchange that continued to shape the identity of Rome, even in the smallest details of Roman daily life. Thus, African trade, with its vast variety of products and cultural influences, became a force propelling Rome further into the future, making the empire not only a great military center, but also a convergence point for the wealth and knowledge of a vast and diverse world. As the Roman Empire expanded its borders, cultural diversity flourished within its cities. Rome, with its cosmopolitan nature, became a space for exchange between the most varied cultures of the ancient world. Among these, the influence of African culture, particularly from the peoples of North Africa and Egypt, was profound and lasting, permeating many aspects of Roman life and challenging the boundaries of what was considered Roman. Amid this cultural exchange, Africa not only left its mark on the arts, but also on religions, sciences, and even architecture of the time. Egypt, one of the greatest cultural and economic powers of ancient Africa, played a key role in shaping Roman identity. Egyptian art, with its symbolic forms and vibrant colors, spread throughout the empire. The worship of Egyptian gods, such as Isis and Serapis, was widely accepted and sometimes even venerated by Romans of all social classes. Temples dedicated to Isis, in particular, were erected in major Roman cities, and the worship of this goddess began to spread throughout Rome as a transnational religious movement, attracting followers from all parts of the empire. African influences were evident in Roman festivals and celebrations. The Egyptians, known for their skills in rhythm and dance, brought traditions that were integrated into Roman banquets and celebrations. Exotic dances and African rhythms became an integral part of public festivities, celebrating the victories of the empire and major moments in Roman life. Roman theater also saw an influx of African influences, with the presence of actors and characters of African origin in many productions, offering a rich and diverse cultural representation. African art was not limited to Egyptian-style sculptures and paintings. African influences were also visible in Roman architecture, especially in religious buildings and the use of symbols. The famous Egyptian obelisk, for example, became an important symbol in Rome, being erected in central locations around the city, such as the Vatican. These obelisks, with their iconic shapes and hieroglyphic inscriptions, were not only decorative, but symbols of Rome's power and conquest over a mysterious and rich land like Egypt. Moreover, the peoples of North Africa also had a huge influence on Roman medicine and science. African philosophers and doctors, particularly those of Egyptian and Nubian origin, brought significant advances to the empire. Egyptian medicine, in particular, was recognized for its sophistication, and many Romans sought out Egyptian sages for treatments, especially for diseases that Roman medicine had yet to cure. African knowledge on anatomy, hygiene practices, and even the use of medicinal herbs was adopted and adapted by the Romans, becoming part of the empire's medical tradition. African contributions also extended to mathematics and astronomy. The Egyptians' mastery of mathematics, particularly geometry, was essential to the development of many Roman techniques, from the construction of roads and aqueducts to the precision in time measurement and astronomical predictions. This knowledge was not only integrated into Roman academic texts, but also became essential to the construction of many Roman engineering marvels, such as the Colosseum and the Pantheon. Still, African presence in the empire was not limited to intellectual and artistic fields. Africans were also known for their military skills, with many serving in Roman legions and special units. Their strength, endurance, and discipline were admired by the Romans and African soldiers, especially those of Nubian and Carthaginian origin, were often called upon to occupy prominent positions in the army. Thus, African presence was multifaceted and intertwined with Roman identity itself. African culture was not simply an addition to Roman traditions, but became a formative force in the empire's very cultural fabric. Art, religion, science, and even the structures of power in Rome were irrevocably influenced by Africa's rich and vibrant heritage. As the Roman Empire expanded, the lands of North Africa and Egypt continued to be a vital source of knowledge and power, and their culture, far from being a marginal presence, became one of the foundations upon which Rome built its grandeur. As the empire conquered new lands and expanded its borders, it also embraced and integrated the influences of peoples like the Africans, whose presence continued to shape the Rome we know today. The interaction between these cultures not only helped create a stronger and more diverse empire, but also gave the Romans the opportunity to experience the best that other ancient cultures had to offer. When we think of ancient Rome, the image that often comes to mind is that of fair-skinned citizens wearing togas and living in the grandeur of the imperial city. However, the reality was much more complex, with a population that reflected the diversity of a vast and multicultural empire. Among the many peoples that made up the empire, Africans occupied an important position, but their image and representation varied depending on the Roman perspective. However, one common theme was present. Africans were seen with both admiration and mystery. The Romans did not have the rigid racial categorization that we know today. For them, the term Ethiopian, a general reference to peoples from sub-Saharan Africa, encompassed a great diversity of individuals whose origins and cultures were vastly different. However, what united this vision was the physical characteristic, dark skin, which became a social and cultural marker of identity. For the Romans, this physical characteristic was often associated with strength, endurance, and in some cases, the exotic. In Roman art, African presence was notably visible. Statues, mosaics, and paintings often depicted Africans, and these representations could be of both common figures and people in positions of prestige. Art was not limited to simple portraits, but also carried symbolic weight. Many Africans were depicted with exaggerated physical traits, such as imposing musculature or a commanding presence, highlighting qualities of strength and virility that the Romans associated with these individuals. From their representations, Africans were idealized as symbols of resistance and prowess. However, the Roman view of Africans was not limited to positive stereotypes. While some were seen as examples of strength and bravery, others were portrayed as exotic and mysterious. The Egyptian, for example, was a symbol of wisdom and mystery, with their ancient culture and deeply spiritual religious practices. The fact that Rome absorbed so many elements from Egypt, such as the worship of gods like Isis and Serapis, reinforced this enigmatic aura surrounding Africans. Many Romans saw Egypt as a place of mysteries and secrets, something that evoked both fascination and fear. In the military context, the figure of the African was synonymous with militarized strength. African soldiers were often depicted as formidable and disciplined warriors with exceptional combat skills. An example of this can be found in the Roman legions, where soldiers of African descent were highly respected. These men were called upon for dangerous battles and demanding tasks, such as guarding the empire's borders. Their image as untamable warriors was firmly cemented in the Roman narrative. Furthermore, slavery in Rome added a distinct dimension to how Africans were perceived. While many Africans were admired for their skills and imposing presence, others were stigmatized as slaves or servants. Roman society accepted slavery as part of its social structure, and many Africans, especially those brought from newly conquered territories, were forced to work in the homes of the wealthy or on large agricultural estates. In this context, the image of Africans was often linked to their subordination. Even among slaves, some earned respect for their skill and intelligence, achieving prominent positions such as doctors, educators, or even high-ranking officials in the households of Roman patricians. At the same time, the lower classes of Roman society had an even more distorted view of Africans. For the plebeians, who lived in a reality of hardship and scarcity, many African slaves were seen as property, subjugated figures whose destinies were tied to the power of their masters. Even among those who interacted with them, this reality created a deep social distance, an idea that Africans were on the margins of public and political life. However, it is important to remember that the African presence was not homogeneous. Africans in the empire were not only soldiers, slaves, or merchants. They were also intellectuals, philosophers, artists, and even rulers. The figure of an African emperor, such as Septimius Severus, subverted the idea that Rome was a city ruled exclusively by citizens of European origin. The fact that he came from Leptis Magna, in modern-day Libya, and rose to the Roman throne, shows the complexity of Roman identity and how it could be defined not only by geographic origin, but by skill, leadership, and power. The representation of Africans in Rome, then, was multifaceted. To the Romans, these individuals were both sources of admiration and mystery, recognized for their strength and resilience, but also viewed with a certain apprehension because of their exotic and enigmatic origins. They were symbols of power and culture, but also subject to a system that marginalized them. The impact of the African presence, however, goes far beyond images and representations. It is reflected in cultural and intellectual contributions, power relations, and the creation of a Rome that was more plural and diverse than many imagine. Throughout Rome's history, the images of Africans shifted from figures of mystery to symbols of respect, reflecting, in many ways, the empire's ability to absorb and transform the cultures it dominated. They were not just exotic and distant images, but essential pieces of the complex puzzle that formed ancient Rome. Across the vast Roman Empire, borders were never just geographical limits. They were meeting points between different cultures, histories, and peoples. One such border extended to the north, where Rome established an imposing domain over Britain. The island was a distant and mysterious place, with a harsh climate and tribes that fiercely resisted occupation. However, something very interesting and rarely discussed is the presence of Africans in this isolated region, far from affluent Rome, but deeply intertwined with the military and cultural history of the empire. In the 3rd century AD, archaeological excavations in the Roman city of York, in Britain, revealed something surprising: the remains of Africans who had lived and died in Britain. This discovery challenged many assumptions about the borders of the Roman Empire and showed us that the African presence was not limited to the warmer Mediterranean regions. Africans were present in every corner of the empire, even in the cold northern lands. Africans who arrived in Britain, like many of their compatriots serving in other parts of the empire, were primarily soldiers. The Roman legions were made up of men from all provinces of the empire, and Africans were recognized for their skill, resilience, and courage in battle. Many of the African soldiers were there not only for their strength, but also for their unwavering loyalty to Rome and the experience they gained in battles across the empire. The presence of African soldiers in Britain was not just a matter of military strength. It also represented a cultural exchange. These African soldiers, far from their homeland, were immersed in a new reality with different customs, cuisine, and beliefs. Just as the Romans absorbed elements of the cultures of the peoples they conquered, the Africans also shared their traditions. African food, rituals, and even religious practices began to mix with the local culture. In York, evidence of a small African community was discovered, helping us understand how diverse the Roman population was in its most distant provinces. In addition to soldiers, there were also African merchants who traveled to Britain, trading exotic products like spices, ivory, gold, and textiles with the local Roman elites. These merchants became part of the social fabric of the city, blending with other cultures and leaving their mark on the region's trade. Over time, these Africans established themselves as citizens or even wealthy traders, playing significant roles in the local economy. The interaction between Africans and Roman Britons is also reflected in art and architecture. There are records of African figures in the paintings and sculptures found in the region. Some of their faces and stories became part of the everyday lives of Roman inhabitants in Britain. At the same time, the Roman legions used their presence on the island as a way to ensure Rome remained dominant, defending the border against barbarian invaders and strengthening the region's power structures. This cultural exchange was not limited to art or trade. Religion also played an important role in this meeting of cultures. The cult of Isis, an Egyptian goddess of great importance in the Roman Empire, had temples in various cities of the empire, and this extended to Britain as well. African soldiers who followed the religion of Isis often introduced it in the regions where they were stationed, creating a religious and cultural link between Northern Europe and Northern Africa. Reflecting on the African presence in Roman Britain, we can see an interconnection of worlds that at first glance seem distant and disconnected. Rather than simply being soldiers and merchants, Africans in Britain brought with them a cultural and historical wealth that left a lasting mark, challenging the perceptions of an exclusively European Rome and showing how the Roman Empire was, in fact, a truly global empire. These Africans, often invisible in traditional Roman narratives, were among the pillars that supported Roman power, not only with their swords but also with their cultural, religious, and social contributions. Roman Britain, with its cold climate and desolate landscapes, would never be the same without the African presence, which helped shape the complexity and diversity of the empire. In one of the most remote regions of the Roman Empire, a stone monument still stands, marking the boundary of Roman rule, Hadrian's Wall. Built in the 2nd century AD by order of Emperor Hadrian, the wall was not only a physical barrier, but also an assertion of power and control over the tribes that inhabited what we now know as Scotland. Its function was to protect the Roman province of Britain from attacks by the barbarian peoples living to the north. However, this imposing structure, which stretches over 120 kilometers, also carries an important secret, revealing the diversity that characterized the Roman Empire, and among the soldiers who patrolled its walls were men from distant origins, Africans. The story of Hadrian's Wall is not just about battles and conquests, but also about cultural exchange and resistance. While the empire tried to consolidate its hold on the most distant regions, its legions were made up of soldiers from all corners of the empire, including African provinces. African soldiers, with their refined military skills and unwavering loyalty to Rome, were sent to Britain to protect this crucial frontier. These soldiers, mostly from North Africa, formed military units known for their bravery and competence in battle. Among them were members of the Cohors Aemarorum Aurelianorum, a military unit that, as the name suggests, was made up of soldiers from Mauritania, a region of what is now Morocco and Algeria. These men, far from their hot and arid lands, were deployed to a cold and challenging climate, where battles against barbarian invaders were frequent. The presence of Africans at Hadrian's Wall is confirmed by several inscriptions found during archaeological excavations. One of these inscriptions mentions the name of an African soldier and his rank within the military unit. This kind of discovery not only reinforces the fact that Africans played important military roles in Roman Britain, but also illustrates that the diversity of the empire knew no borders, not even in its most isolated regions. African military units were known for their strength and discipline, and their contribution was crucial in safeguarding the empire's frontier. In addition to their military skills, these African soldiers also brought their culture, faith, and traditions with them. Hadrian's Wall, far from being just a defensive structure, became a meeting point of cultures and religions. Some African soldiers, for example, followed the cult of Isis, the Egyptian goddess, and introduced it to some of the fortified cities along the wall. Thus, not only was Rome's military might present at its borders, but also its religious and cultural diversity. The African soldiers guarding Hadrian's Wall were not just men of arms, but also men of faith, commerce, and culture. They formed a deep connection with the region of Britain, interacting with the local population and leaving their mark on art, religion, and even trade. African merchants, who followed the soldiers or settled in the provinces, also brought exotic products and new ideas that further enriched the multicultural environment of Roman Britain. Over time, Hadrian's Wall ceased to be merely a military fortification and became a symbol of the cultural integration that characterized the Roman Empire. The impact of African soldiers in the region is a clear example of how Rome not only conquered, but also assimilated, mixed, and integrated the cultures of the peoples it dominated. Hadrian's Wall, built to protect Rome, became a link between different worlds, where Africans, Romans, and Britons met and influenced each other's histories. The African presence at Hadrian's Wall is a powerful reminder that Roman history is not just about emperors and Roman legions, but about the many cultures and peoples who contributed to the building of a truly global empire. This wall, still standing after nearly 2,000 years, is a silent witness to the diversity that defined Rome and the vital role Africans played in protecting and shaping one of the longest-lasting empires in history. When we think of the Roman army, many images come to mind: the iron discipline of the legionaries, the intricate military strategy, the great battles, and the victorious generals. However, the Roman Empire, with its vast expanse, was made up not only of Roman soldiers, but also men from all parts of its multicultural empire, including soldiers from Africa. These Africans played essential roles on many fronts, and over time, some African units became integral to the Roman military machine, leaving a legacy of strength, skill, and loyalty. The presence of Africans in the Roman legions is a lesser-known but fundamental aspect of Roman military history. Throughout the empire, units formed by soldiers from Africa stood out for their courage and effectiveness in combat. Among these units was the Cohors Aemarorum Aurelianorum, composed of men from Mauritania, a region that today includes Morocco and Algeria. These soldiers were not only known for their fighting ability, but also for their capacity to endure challenging conditions and their fervor in protecting Rome's interests. These African cohorts were often assigned to regions of the empire where fighting against invaders or rebellious local populations required relentless resistance. One of the most impressive aspects of these military units was their ability to operate in difficult terrain, such as deserts or dense forests, and their skill in using guerrilla tactics when necessary. It was common for African soldiers to be sent to remote frontiers or outposts, where their skill and endurance were essential for maintaining imperial order. But the contribution of Africans to the Roman army was not limited to the battlefield. Many African soldiers were also responsible for building crucial infrastructure for the empire, such as roads, fortresses, and even cities. The Roman legions were known for their ability to quickly construct defensive structures that allowed for swift troop movements. African soldiers, with their experience working in arid and difficult climates, played an essential role in these projects, showing that their usefulness in the Roman army extended far beyond simple combat. Moreover, some of these African units were highly respected for their skill and discipline, even being commanded by African officers. A notable example is the commander of the Cohors Aemarorum Aurelianorum, who, due to his experience and loyalty, achieved prominent positions within the army. This rise of Africans to leadership positions within the Roman army reflects the meritocracy that permeated the Roman military ranks, where talent and skill were valued more than origin. Over time, these African units became key players not only in military campaigns, but also in the internal stability of the empire. Their presence in strategic locations, such as the eastern frontiers and northern Africa, ensured that Rome could resist external threats while maintaining its integrity within its vast provinces. The discipline, organization, and loyalty of these African units directly contributed to maintaining order and Roman control over such a vast and complex empire. The impact of African military units on the Roman army was significant, not only in terms of military strategy, but also in shaping the empire's identity. They played a crucial role in adapting Roman military tactics to the diverse geographic and cultural realities across the empire, helping to shape a fighting force capable of facing any challenge. These African units, often invisible in traditional historical narratives, were fundamental to Rome's success and longevity, being essential pieces of a military machine that managed to expand and maintain the greatest power of the ancient world. Thus, the contribution of Africans to the Roman army goes beyond mere military presence. It reflects a story of integration, adaptation, and resilience. In an empire where cultures blended and mingled, African units not only strengthened the empire's borders, but were also crucial in creating a more robust and resilient military and cultural structure. The story of Rome is not only the story of its emperors, but also the story of the remarkable journeys of those who rose from humble or distant origins to the imperial throne. One of the most notable examples of this phenomenon is that of Septimius Severus, the first African emperor of Rome, whose rise to power defied expectations and changed the course of imperial history. Born in 145 AD in the prosperous city of Leptis Magna, in present-day Libya, Septimius Severus was a man whose heritage was deeply tied to African lands. From a prominent local family, he grew up in a context where the Roman Empire was already expanding beyond its traditional borders, absorbing cultures and populations from all over the known world. Unlike other emperors from more central and Roman regions, like Italy or Gaul, Severus brought with him the strength, vision, and determination of someone who grew up on the outskirts of Rome, yet always under the shadow of the empire. His rise to the throne was not simple. In 193 AD, the death of Emperor Commodus, marked by intrigue and a power vacuum, led to a series of conflicts between various factions vying for control of the empire. Severus, a respected military commander and influential figure in the eastern region, seized the chaotic situation to gain power. He was proclaimed emperor by the troops in Pannonia and began a journey that would lead him to consolidate his authority over Rome. Severus had a clear strategic vision: to strengthen the empire's borders and restore military discipline. He knew that, to ensure the stability of Rome, it would be necessary to maintain control over its farthest provinces and ensure the Roman legions were more loyal and effective than ever. During his reign, he implemented a series of military reforms, including a pay raise for soldiers, the creation of more specialized units, and the incorporation of new combat techniques. But beyond his military reforms, one of Severus's greatest contributions was promoting African soldiers to prestigious positions. As an African by birth, he understood the importance of more deeply integrating the province's populations into the heart of imperial power. For him, Rome should not be an exclusive city, but a truly global empire. By promoting Africans to command positions, Severus not only demonstrated confidence in his compatriots' abilities, but also broke social barriers that had previously seemed insurmountable. As emperor, Severus reinforced Africa's presence within the empire. He was a great advocate for African cultures and ensured that the provinces of North Africa had a stronger voice in the political arena of Rome. His influence was felt not only in foreign policies, but also in how Rome interacted with its African provinces, reflecting his pride and belonging to that land. His visit to Britain was also an important milestone. During his rule, he reinforced Hadrian's Wall, constructing fortifications and ensuring the empire's boundaries were respected. His presence in the region symbolized Rome's power, but also the importance of strengthening unity among the various provinces, including the African ones, to ensure the empire remained stable and strong. Septimius Severus also made history by establishing a dynasty, the Severan dynasty, which lasted until 235 AD. Although his reign was interrupted by internal conflicts and succession problems, his legacy was undeniable. He represented the rise of a new type of emperor, someone who was not only a military commander, but also a visionary capable of connecting different cultures and regions under Rome's banner. In the end, the story of Septimius Severus is not only about an African emperor, but about a leader who knew how to unite the forces of his empire, respect its diverse origins, and strengthen Rome's legacy for future generations. His rule not only consolidated Rome's power, but also redefined the empire's identity, proving that the greatness of Rome was not limited to its origins, but extended to all those who contributed to its strengthening and expansion. The Roman army, one of the pillars of the empire's power, was a reflection of its immense diversity. Although most soldiers were recruited from various parts of the empire, the Roman army was not composed solely of native Romans from Italy, but by men from all provinces, including Africa. The Romans understood early on that a strong army did not only depend on local soldiers, but on the integration of different peoples and cultures, whose skills could enrich the war machine. Recruiting soldiers from various ethnic backgrounds was a successful strategy because the Romans knew that diversity not only increased the number of fighters, but also the variety of tactics and knowledge. Soldiers of African origins, such as the Nubians and Berbers, were particularly valued for their combat skills and resilience. Furthermore, some of these units, like the Nubian archers, were considered highly effective, playing a crucial role in Roman campaigns in distant lands. The policy of diversity in the Roman army also allowed soldiers from distant provinces to become Roman citizens after years of service. This practice not only encouraged enlistment, but also promoted soldiers' loyalty to the empire, creating a sense of belonging. Over the years, this helped create a strong bond between the provinces and the heart of Rome. As these soldiers became more than just fighters, they became full-fledged citizens with access to a new identity and benefits. This diversity also ensured the stability of the empire, since Roman troops were predominantly composed of a wide range of people, all interested in protecting the borders and ensuring control over the vast Roman territory. Even after centuries of evolution, the cultural blend within the Roman army continued to be a unifying force, turning the empire into a true network of different peoples united under one goal: the domination of a vast and complex world. While the army was the backbone of ancient Rome, the empire's administration also played a crucial role in maintaining its vastness and power. Among the many layers of Roman administration, Africans stood out, holding important positions in the provinces and even in the heart of the empire. Their presence in the Roman government exemplifies how the empire's borders were far from being limited to Italian or European lands. In fact, Africans held leadership roles, influencing policies and decisions fundamental to the future of Rome. After the rise of Septimius Severus to the throne, there was a significant increase in the number of Africans in administrative roles. The African emperor had a clear vision that citizens from the provinces should not be marginalized, but on the contrary, could actively contribute to Rome's prosperity. With this mindset, he appointed Africans to strategic positions, from governors of provinces to administrators of vital resources for the empire, like Egypt's grain or Mauritania's gold mines. Moreover, the Roman administration was marked by complexity and the need for specialists to coordinate the empire. African peoples, especially those from North Africa, with their deep cultural and administrative roots, were crucial in this scenario. Their organizational and management skills helped keep the Roman administrative machine running. They were not only soldiers or traders. Many Africans excelled for their intelligence and ability to make decisions that directly affected the security and prosperity of the empire. The integration of Africans into the Roman government was a reflection of how diversity, far from being seen as a weakness, was one of Rome's greatest strengths. Africans, like other provincial peoples, began to have a significant voice in the administration, helping shape the fate of an empire that saw itself as a great fusion of cultures and identities. By doing so, they not only strengthened the empire, but also left a legacy of inclusion and diversity that would shape the history of the Western world. Lucius Quietus was a military commander whose skills and leadership were crucial to Rome's success in its eastern campaigns. Born in North Africa, he rose to prominence during a decisive moment in Roman history: the reign of Trajan, the emperor known for his military conquests and expansion of the empire. Quietus, a man of Moroccan descent, proved that the loyalty and courage of a soldier were not dependent on their origin, but on their ability to fight for the empire. His story is one of many tales of African ascension and glory in the Roman Empire, but his fame was solidified in the campaigns in Judea. When appointed to lead Roman forces in Judea, Lucius Quietus faced fierce resistance, not only from the local populations, but also from the difficult geographic and climatic conditions. However, it was his strategic ability that truly made the difference. He employed innovative tactics that destabilized the enemy and secured a Roman victory. His determination and leadership were not overlooked by Trajan, who hailed him as one of the most competent generals of his time. More than just a military leader, Lucius Quietus became a symbol of the diversity within the Roman army. His rise to high command, although admired, also challenged traditional views of the time about who could lead and under what circumstances. He wasn't just a general, he was an example of how ancient Rome, with its diversity, allowed the most capable individuals to rise, regardless of their origin. His journey still inspires today, showing that competence and dedication can overcome social and cultural barriers. Lucius Quietus' legacy goes beyond military victories. He helped consolidate the empire in key regions and demonstrated the power of cultural integration, where men of different backgrounds united to form an unbeatable force. His name may have faded over the centuries, but his accomplishments continue to highlight the crucial role of Africans in the Roman Empire, a contribution often underestimated but vital to Rome's survival and expansion. Slavery in ancient Rome was a deeply rooted institution, but contrary to what many believe, it was not solely based on race. In fact, the Romans enslaved people from various backgrounds for different reasons, such as war, debt, and even birth. However, Africans played a significant role in this system. They were primarily brought from African provinces, such as Mauritania and Egypt, often as a result of military conflicts or trade agreements. The presence of Africans as slaves was not only common, but also crucial for the functioning of Roman society. While some Africans worked in agricultural roles or in mines, others were employed in more refined tasks, such as serving in the homes of aristocrats or even holding administrative positions. For example, many Africans worked as teachers, doctors, or artisans in Rome, performing tasks that required specialized skills. Although considered property, these slaves were of great importance to the Roman economy and culture, playing key roles in sustaining the elite and the empire at large. However, the life of a Roman slave was not solely marked by suffering and exploitation. The manumission system, which allowed slaves to be freed, was present in the empire, and many Africans were able to gain their freedom. Manumission was seen as a socially accepted process, and slaves who distinguished themselves or accumulated wealth could even buy their freedom. Once freed, these Africans became Roman citizens, and in some cases, rose in social rank, becoming successful traders or acquiring influential status. Despite this, the social stigma associated with former slaves was difficult to overcome. Even when freed, many African ex-slaves were constantly reminded of their past, facing social barriers that placed them in a lower position within Roman society. Nevertheless, social mobility for those who gained their freedom represented a rare opportunity in a system that, for the most part, limited the possibilities for advancement. In ancient Rome, African slaves were particularly known for their skills and abilities, which made them valuable to Roman society. While many were forced to do heavy labor, such as in agriculture and mines, others stood out for their abilities and served in more prestigious roles. Some Africans were trained to become gladiators, celebrated in arenas and gaining fame for their strength and skill. African gladiators, with their endurance and combat abilities, were often crowd favorites, becoming celebrities in ancient Rome. In addition to fighting in arenas, Africans were also frequently used as servants in the homes of wealthy Romans. Many were employed as attendants, cooks, or secretaries, roles in which they could demonstrate great intelligence and education. Although treated as property, African slaves in Rome were not just objects of exploitation. Many had valuable knowledge that contributed to the progress of Roman society. Some Africans, especially those from regions like Egypt, became respected doctors, mathematicians, and philosophers, and their intellectual contributions were essential to the development of medicine and science in the empire. Furthermore, Africans who excelled in their roles, such as doctors or artists, could be rewarded with more freedom or even wealth. Manumission, or liberation, was a common practice, and many former African slaves became Roman citizens, gaining a position in society. Some became successful traders or even acquired land, achieving a social ascension rarely seen among other slaves. However, even those who gained freedom faced a social stigma due to their past as slaves, which made full integration into high Roman society difficult. The life of African slaves in Rome was, therefore, multifaceted. While often in subordinate positions, they played fundamental roles in Roman culture and economy, often being the invisible engine that kept the empire running. The legacy of Africans, both as slaves and as freed individuals, left an indelible mark on ancient Rome, which was shaped by their contributions in various fields, from entertainment to the arts and medicine. The process of slave liberation in ancient Rome was a complex and multifaceted aspect of the empire's slavery system. Although many slaves lived under extremely harsh conditions, the possibility of being freed, or manumitted, offered a rare but significant escape for some. Manumission took place in various forms, with the most common being the granting of freedom by the owner, which could occur out of kindness, as a reward for services rendered, or to promote the slave's loyalty. Additionally, slaves themselves could buy their freedom if they were able to accumulate the necessary money. This practice was called peculium, a fund that the slave could accumulate over time, often by performing paid work during periods when they were not on duty. After manumission, the former slave acquired Roman citizenship, but the transition to freedom was not always straightforward. Although liberation meant formal freedom, the former slave still faced many difficulties. Some, especially those who had acquired wealth or valuable skills, could build a new life as free citizens and even become wealthy. However, even former slaves who became citizens were often viewed with some prejudice, as their former status as slaves still marked them socially. Freedom was an important step, but true social ascension was often limited by these invisible barriers. In addition, the manumission of slaves was also regulated by law. In certain cases, a slave could be freed through a will, a formal act that allowed an owner to leave their property to their slaves. Sometimes, these freed slaves would receive a financial compensation or land as part of the agreement. While this practice allowed some social mobility for the former slaves, it also led to the creation of a class of people who were marginalized in Roman society, without high social status, even though they were legally free. For many, freedom did not mean the end of their struggles, but rather the beginning of a new way of facing the challenges of Roman society. This process of manumission was essential to the dynamics of Roman society, allowing many Africans, for example, to stop being considered property and start building their own identities within the empire. However, the path to true equality and social acceptance was often tortuous, and many former African slaves had to fight against prejudice and discrimination to achieve real freedom. Not just legal, but also social. The social death was a deeply ingrained concept in the reality of slaves in ancient Rome. Although physically freed, many former slaves faced a form of symbolic death by losing their previous identity. When a slave was sold, their history, their name, and even their origins were erased, as they were often forced to adopt the new owner's name and abandon their culture and family ties. For the Romans, the sale of a slave was as simple as buying a piece of property, and what was left behind was their former identity, a loss that represented the destruction of that human being's roots. This forced change not only affected their name, but also their social position, creating a new person without a history in the Roman context. This social death was especially cruel for Africans, as many were ripped from their native lands, and, by being forced to adopt a new life in ancient Rome, lost their connection to African culture. For many, this loss of identity was painful and permanent. Even after being freed, the mark of their origins and the experience of being treated as property remained in their lives. They often found themselves limited in their social interactions, facing difficulties in rising to a respectable position in Roman society, regardless of their skills or intelligence. However, social death was not the absolute end. Some former slaves, after manumission, sought ways to rebuild their identity within Roman society by achieving a new status. Many succeeded. Some became prosperous merchants, others opened their own businesses, or excelled in areas like the arts and medicine. However, even these success stories were exceptional, and Roman society, with its rigid hierarchy, often viewed former slaves as members of an inferior class. Thus, social death was not just a loss of identity, but an invisible barrier that former slaves had to constantly face. Fighting against this social death required courage, resilience, and often luck. Many former African slaves were constantly reminded of their past, and even after gaining their freedom, true social freedom always seemed distant. Overcoming this barrier was a crucial part of the experience of Africans in ancient Rome, and many of them, despite facing so many difficulties, were able to leave a legacy that is still remembered today. In ancient Rome, gladiators were celebrated as heroes and became figures of great importance in popular imagination. Among them, Africans played a prominent role, both in the arena and outside of it. These men, often from African provinces such as Mauritania, Egypt, and Carthage, were known for their exceptional combat skills, which earned them great respect among their fellow gladiators and the Roman public. Their physical strength, endurance, and fighting skills were admired, and many became true stars, cheered by spectators watching bloody and intense fights in the arenas. In a society where violence was a popular form of entertainment, African gladiators represented both brutality and strategic skill, qualities highly valued by the Romans. Despite the extreme living conditions and lack of freedom, some African gladiators managed to stand out so much that they gained fame, which gave them a rare chance for social ascension. The fights in the Roman arenas were not just physical battles, but also reflections of social status, and gladiators who performed well could win significant prizes. For many, fame meant the possibility of gaining their freedom after a series of impressive victories, a feat that made these Africans symbols of resistance and courage for many Romans. Some were even freed, won valuable prizes, or gained the right to leave the arena with a status that could change their lives forever. However, the life of a gladiator was extremely difficult and dangerous. The fight for survival in the arena required deadly skills, and Africans, like other gladiators, were trained in special schools called ludi. These schools were centers of discipline and cruelty, where gladiators were prepared for combat, often being treated as mere objects to be molded for the entertainment of the Roman public. But despite the hardships, many African gladiators became symbols of resistance to oppression, showing that even under the most extreme conditions, human strength and fighting spirit could shine. Some historians argue that the presence of African gladiators in the Roman arenas also had a significant cultural impact. The strength, courage, and character of many of these fighters, combined with their exotic origins, helped create a lasting fascination with African exoticism in ancient Rome. The very figure of the African gladiator, with their formidable skills and often fearless behavior, became a symbol of power and resistance, revered by both Romans and the peoples of the empire. Even after their deaths, their image endured, immortalized in statues, mosaics, and stories that went beyond mere entertainment, reflecting the complexity of Roman society. In the vast and diverse Roman Empire, cultural influences came from all parts of the empire, and religion was no exception. The African presence in the empire was reflected not only in trade, politics, and the arts, but also in spiritual beliefs and religious practices. One of the most notable contributions was the adoption of African cults, especially those of Egyptian gods. Isis, the Egyptian goddess of fertility, magic, and healing, became one of the most popular deities in the Roman Empire. She was worshipped in temples in Rome and other parts of the empire, and her cult was particularly attractive to Romans seeking protection, health, and prosperity. In addition to Isis, the god Serapis, associated with healing and regeneration, also gained enormous popularity, symbolizing the fusion of Egyptian and Greek religions. The Egyptian gods were not the only African cults to influence Roman religion. The cult of Mithras, originating from ancient Persian traditions and with strong African connections, became particularly popular among Roman soldiers. The Mithraic cult involved secret rituals, with ceremonies held in caves or underground temples, and its followers believed that Mithras, the god of light and truth, had powers of protection and purification. Mithras' association with war, protection, and fraternity among soldiers caused his cult to spread quickly throughout the Roman legions, practiced secretly in various parts of the empire. Mithras, like other African cults, offered Romans a spirituality that provided them with a sense of belonging and security, especially in times of war. In addition to gods and cults, African religious practices were also reflected in festivals, rituals, and popular celebrations in Rome. Many Romans, especially those from lower classes, participated in festivals that mixed elements from various cultures within the empire, including African. These events, which often involved dances, music, and theatrical performances, celebrated the various African deities, creating an atmosphere of religious diversity. African religion intertwined so deeply with Roman beliefs that it became an integral part of the daily life of many Romans, reinforcing the idea that Rome was a truly cosmopolitan empire, open to new cultural influences. This diffusion of African beliefs throughout the empire also served as a form of cultural resistance. For many Africans living under Roman rule, religion was a way to keep their roots and identities alive, transmitting their own values and worldviews to the empire they were part of. The acceptance of these beliefs by a significant portion of the Roman population shows how religious diversity was part of the process of integrating different cultures into the empire. In this way, African cults not only enriched the religious landscape of Rome, but also became a symbol of the intertwining of cultures that characterized ancient Rome. Trade between Rome and the African provinces was key to the empire's economic success. The vast African territory provided a rich variety of products that were highly valued in Rome, and the trade routes linking the Mediterranean to these regions ensured a steady flow of goods. Egypt, for example, was essential for feeding Rome, as its fertile lands produced large quantities of wheat, which were sent to supply the Roman population. This agricultural trade was vital, as Rome depended on wheat to feed its massive urban populations. Furthermore, trade routes also brought luxurious African products to Rome, such as ivory, which was used to create statues and luxury furniture, and exotic fabrics, which became status symbols among the Roman elite. In addition to agricultural and manufactured products, the African provinces also played an important role in supplying labor to Rome, particularly through the slave trade. The trafficking of African slaves was a common practice, and many of them were brought to Rome to work in various sectors, including agriculture, construction, domestic services, and even government. However, the relationship between Rome and its African traders was not one-sided. African merchants, such as those from regions like Carthage and Mauritania, had direct access to the Roman elite, establishing trade networks that not only included the supply of goods, but also the exchange of information and culture. Over time, these merchants became influential figures within Roman society, and their commercial relationships helped consolidate the economic power of the African provinces within the empire. The African presence in Roman trade also reflected the complex social and cultural dynamics of the empire. While the slave trade was an important part of this exchange, many Africans did not limit themselves to subordinate roles. Many of them became successful merchants, particularly those from regions like Egypt, Mauritania, and Numidia, who integrated into the Roman market and over time became wealthy and powerful. The exchange of goods and services, in addition to wealth, contributed to the growth of Roman cities and the expansion of infrastructure, such as roads and ports, which facilitated the circulation of goods. Therefore, the African economy had a lasting impact on Rome's prosperity, helping to solidify its status as a commercial powerhouse in the ancient world. This exchange of goods and ideas also contributed to the cultural diversity of ancient Rome. Trade with Africa not only brought material wealth, but also cultural influences that were reflected in art, religion, cuisine, and fashion. Products such as perfumes, spices, and exotic fabrics were integrated into Roman lifestyles, and many African traditions were absorbed into Roman society, creating a rich cultural tapestry. In this way, trade between Rome and Africa was not only an exchange of goods, but also a channel for the integration and exchange of cultures that helped shape the Roman Empire in a unique way. The contribution of African intellectuals to Roman culture was crucial, although it is often overlooked in the traditional narrative of Roman history. Some of the greatest thinkers, philosophers, and writers of the empire were of African origin, and their works left a lasting legacy. A notable example is the historian Apuleius, a Berber African who wrote the famous work The Golden Ass, one of the most important literary productions of ancient Rome. Apuleius was not only a distinguished writer, but also a philosopher who advocated for the study of ancient religious and mystical traditions. His work reflected the influence of African and Eastern cultures, which were intertwined with Roman practices. Another important intellectual was the philosopher and rhetorician Tertullian, originally from Carthage. He was one of the most influential figures in early Christianity, known for his fervent defense of the Christian faith and his contributions to theology and philosophy. Tertullian wrote extensively about Christian doctrines and opposed the persecution of Christians in the empire, standing out as a powerful voice in religious debates. His work helped shape early Christianity and influenced Western Christian thought for centuries. In addition to Apuleius and Tertullian, other African intellectuals also had an impact on medicine, mathematics, and the sciences. The Egyptian Galen, for example, was one of the most respected doctors in ancient Rome, and his discoveries in anatomy and medicine influenced the field for centuries. He was responsible for laying the foundations for understanding human physiology, and his work was widely studied during the Renaissance. Although his African origins are often ignored, his importance to Roman and world medicine is undeniable. These intellectuals not only influenced literature, religion, and science, but also helped challenge prejudiced views about the contribution of Africans to Roman civilization. Their presence in the arts and sciences shows that Africans played a vital role in shaping Roman culture and thought, contributing unique perspectives and enriching the empire with their intellectual traditions. Although many Africans in ancient Rome were initially enslaved or came from humble origins, the Roman system offered opportunities for these individuals to rise socially, gaining status and wealth. Over the centuries, Africans began to occupy prominent positions in various spheres of Roman society. In the military, for example, many Africans rose to high ranks, such as centurions and commanders of military units, earning respect for their combat skills and leadership. These victories in Roman battles often led to the granting of Roman citizenship and financial rewards, offering Africans a rare chance to thrive. In addition to the armed forces, trade also played a crucial role in the social rise of Africans. African merchants, especially those from Egypt and Mauritania, became influential figures in the Roman economic scene. Their skill in negotiating exotic and valuable products such as spices, ivory, and gold, positioned them among the Roman commercial elite. Some of these merchants managed to accumulate great wealth and, as a result, rose socially, becoming respected members of Roman society. Their rise also reflected the growing appreciation of African cultures and the acceptance of their contributions to the empire. However, the social rise of Africans in ancient Rome was not limited to just the military and commercial fields. Some Africans managed to hold important political positions, influencing decisions that shaped the fate of the empire. The Emperor Septimius Severus himself, born in Leptis Magna, a city in present-day Libya, is a clear example of how Africans could reach the top of the Roman political hierarchy. During his reign, Severus promoted Africans to high-responsibility positions, solidifying the importance of the African presence in the Roman government. He is also remembered for his skill in balancing different social and ethnic groups within the empire, reinforcing the idea that diversity was a key pillar of Rome's stability. This social rise was not only based on individual merit, but also on the recognition of the African skills and talents in various areas. Over time, Rome learned to value diversity and recognize that the cultural wealth, military competencies, and commercial skills of Africans were essential components for the empire's continued success. This social and political integration helped create a more complex and dynamic empire, where class and ethnic barriers were, in many cases, overcome in favor of merit and contributions to the common good. The legacy of Africans in the Roman Empire is vast and multifaceted, being a fundamental part of the fabric that sustained the greatness of Rome. Although history has often obscured African contributions to Roman civilization, their influences can still be seen in various ways, both in artifacts and archaeological discoveries. Roman art, for example, features representations of Africans in statues and mosaics, highlighting their presence at all levels of Roman society. Africans were depicted in scenes of battle, feasts, and religious rituals, often emphasizing their strength, skills, and dignity. In addition to art, the African impact is clearly evident in Roman architecture and infrastructure. Egypt, for example, had a lasting influence on Roman architecture, especially in the design of temples and monuments. The famous Egyptian obelisk, a symbol of power and divinity, was adopted by the Romans, and several of these obelisks were transported to Rome, adorning squares and temples. The fusion of Egyptian architectural styles with Roman sophistication is a testament to the cultural integration that characterized the empire. Elements of African cultures can also be seen in innovations in engineering and the development of Roman cities, which adopted construction models and techniques from Africa. The African legacy extends further into the realm of religion, where Egyptian gods like Isis and Serapis gained popularity among Romans. Temples dedicated to Isis were built in various parts of the empire, and the cult of Serapis spread quickly, reflecting the acceptance of African beliefs and practices within the Roman Empire. This religious exchange was an example of how ancient Rome, with its cosmopolitan character, absorbed and adapted elements from the diverse cultures that made up the empire. The impact of Africans is also present in the sciences, especially in medicine, where the Egyptians, with their vast anatomical and medical knowledge, influenced Roman practices. Physicians like Galen, of African origin, were key to the advancement of medicine, and their works continued to be studied in Europe during the Middle Ages. Mathematics and astronomy also benefited from African advancements, with Egyptians and other North African peoples playing an important role in preserving and transmitting scientific knowledge to the Roman world. In short, the African legacy in the Roman Empire was essential to the development and perpetuation of Rome's greatness. Its impact cannot be reduced to a mere mention. It lives on in the structures, religion, arts, and sciences that shaped the empire. To this day, many of the traces of this influence are revealed through archaeological and historical research, showing that the African presence was crucial to Rome's history and to the formation of the Western world. Now that you know the profound and lasting impact of the African presence in the Roman Empire, it's impossible to ignore how these influences helped shape Rome's greatness and, in a way, the cultural legacy of the Western world. If you found this content interesting, don't forget to leave your comment below. I want to know what you think about this often forgotten chapter of Roman history. Like the video if you learned something new, and of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming dives into fascinating topics about ancient Rome. See you next time.